Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. Today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about understanding the performance elements involved when we talk about changing things up, or people saying, oh, I want to do a different exercise to work a muscle differently. And people say things like that without putting any thought into it. And they always want to focus on little bitty small exercises. And that's not where our focus needs to be. Yeah, I'm not saying some smaller movements don't have their place. I do some right now. But the fact is, they don't give you that much muscle growth. So when we're really talking about changing things up, everyone wants to do it randomly without thinking about, am I really training a different performance element? Am I doing this in a way that's going to maximize muscle fiber recruitment? Because that's the point, isn't it? Why in the world would you change anything up if your goal wasn't to maximize muscle fiber recruitment? Maybe you have one muscle or some aspects of a muscle that you feel have muscle fibers that aren't being worked as effectively or as completely as they could be with what you're doing at the moment, and you have some areas you need to break up or break the monotony up. But if you need a different exercise, shouldn't you be thinking about that in terms of muscle fiber recruitment also? Let's say you swap something out for a week or a block. If it's an inferior training response to what you're doing, that's going to be a problem, isn't it? It's going to be a problem, isn't it? And here's what I would say. Here's where our focus needs to be if our goal is to maximize muscle fiber recruitment. We need to be picking exercises that either initiate a stretch reflex or that train from a dead stop. Perfect example right there, stretch reflex. That was a barbell squat. Notice I use a stretch reflex at the bottom. All right. Stretch reflex at the bottom. When we start opposing that to other exercises, our other option is dead stop training. Exercises that break up the eccentric concentric chain. Now, this is an interesting topic because here's what a lot of it has to do with. When you are forced to break up the eccentric concentric chain, you're also forced to use a lighter weight. That's the big difference that we need to understand when it comes to recovery. And this is where we strike the balance in muscle fiber recruitment versus recovery. All right, what's the one thing you're going to notice? Watch my floor press. My floor press is technically a couple inches shorter than my bench press. You just saw me do it, right? I also move about 5% less weight. Same thing. Watch my box squat. Different bar path, and technically the range of motion is a hair shorter, isn't it? Because I'm doing the wider stance, right? I'm not going really any deeper than parallel. I've limited the range of motion just slightly. Now, these aren't partials in the traditional sense, guys. Partials are when you start cutting the range of motion considerably, not a couple inches. Yet I'm forced to use a lighter weight. We're forced to use a lighter weight on dead stop exercises. Why? Because we lose the stretch reflex. Now, usually there's one muscle involved that gets a stretch reflex, and that stretch reflex has its own motor pattern to it. It has its own muscle fiber recruitment. In fact, stretch reflex exercises tend to score extremely high on an EMG in the muscle they get the stretch reflex in, right? They score very, very high. They also allow you to lift the heaviest weight. When you compare the dip, for example, weighted dip versus even your close grip bench press with a similar grip width, you can usually do 3 to 5 reps with your 1 to 2 rep max on the weighted dip versus your bench press, particularly a close grip, right? Why can you do more weight on the weighted dip? It technically is a slightly longer range of motion for most of us, right? Those of us who have big chests, we're limited on range of motion on the bench. What happens with the dip, though? It allows us to move a heavier weight. We can dip more than we can bench. Anyone who practices both exercises can. Again, at least with similar grip widths, even though it has a slightly longer range of motion, it has a stretch reflex, and it allows you to lift more weight. Well, lifts that allow you to lift more weight also impede your recovery more. They're harder to recover from. Particularly standing ones, they have more axial loading. So, I mean, if you watch the difference in all of these I'm doing, I'm giving you guys 3 different forms of press. I'm giving you the weighted dip, I'm doing the close grip pause bench, and then we're doing the floor press. The weighted dip, you can do the most weight. The more close grip bench is more of your primary movement, and then you do the least weight with the floor press. What's interesting is that if we were talking about overall development, we could argue that the dip has the most potential for development. Better stretch reflex than the bench press, Longer range of motion, heavier weight. That does maximize muscle growth or muscle fiber recruitment, but at what cost? It's also the hardest to recover from. It's hardest to recover from. But when you go compare it, we start looking at EMGs, the floor press, even done with a partial, right? Even done with a partial, even with a slightly lighter weight, even though it's a few inches shorter range of motion from what you can do on a dip, has just as good of muscle fiber recruitment. Maybe not in the triceps, but it seems to in the pecs. Because there's something to be said for initiating that explosive movement from a dead stop. It also forces you to use a lighter weight. It's easier to recover from. So here's what I would suggest to people. When we start looking at these different variations, what I would tell you is that for most of your main building phases, stretch reflex exercises are actually ideal. In other words, when you're at a period of time to where recovery versus volume is not a big issue and you are trying to get the most muscle growth possible, the stretch reflex exercises, like the perfect example, the weighted dip. I mean, we could say that with a normal bench press. It gets some stretch reflex. So I'm just using these as examples. But stretch reflex exercises have the potential for a lot of muscle growth. They allow you to lift the most weight. Right? They allow you to lift the most weight. Again, the exceptions being things like the deadlift. But even then, the deadlift, if you could bounce off the bottom, hell, I guess you could lift more weight. Deadlift is its own beast, totally separate topic. It doesn't train like anything else. But these stretch reflex exercises allow for the most weight to be used, usually through the longest range of motion. Therefore, for general mass building, they tend to be superior. I would tell people stretch reflex is good. All right? You need to be looking at exercises that give a stretch reflex. But because they allow the heaviest weight and they require the heaviest weight to be used to get the muscle fiber recruitment, they're also the hardest to recover from. When you are plateauing, and we get to be more advanced lifters oftentimes and we need more training volume, I think that there's something to be said for these paused exercises. Exercises that require you to come to a dead stop. It's things like the box squat, things like the floor press. Why? They force you to use less weight. Are they really inferior from a muscle fiber recruitment? Not really, because the stretch reflex has its own neuromuscular benefits, but the dead stop has its own as well. It has its own as well. And they tend to give direct carryover. They give direct carryover. The box squat will carry over directly to the regular squat as soon as you practice getting the stretch reflex back in, right? However, it's easier to recover from. Why? Because you have to use 10, in some cases 15%. Some of the guys who really, really train the box squat feel that it's usually your maxes are as much as 15% lighter on a regular. We're talking the deep box, not what people do onto a bench. When you're squatting onto a bench, that is not a box squat. That's a bench squat, and it's way higher. That's like a high box. You can probably squat a lot more on that. Right? You can squat a lot more. When you're having to go to parallel and then stop on the box and you completely remove the eccentric concentric chain, the weights start going down considerably. You're forced to use a lighter weight. Less axial loading, but you can get very, very high amounts of muscle fiber recruitment, right? Because you're having to initiate everything with a heavy weight from a dead stop, from a complete dead stop. Like the floor press and the box squat are both examples. And look at the way they score on EMGs. They score tremendously. But they allow you to up your training volume with a slightly lighter weight with similar amounts of muscle fiber recruitment. And they're exercises that give direct carryover. Right? The floor press will carry over to your bench. The floor press will carry over to your dip. The box squat will carry over to your regular squat, and in some cases, like I've said before, like that wider stance, like that carries over to the sumo deadlift. They can improve your bigger lifts. Dead stop training really, really is one of the ways to go. Finding variations that are true dead stop. I don't just mean pause work. I'm talking true dead stop. All right? The floor press, the box squat, they force you to train from a dead stop. When you are plateaued as a more advanced lifter and you need to add training volume, but you're struggling with things like max recoverable volume on your big exercises, All right, that is where these things start to really, really, really come in handy because they have direct carryover. They're massive muscle builders, right? Massive muscle builders. But they force you to use a lighter weight. Therefore, you recover better on a set for set rate, rep for rep basis when we're riding the bleeding edge of maximum recoverable volume. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.